My bio might sound fantastic on paper, but I'm a provider at the basic level, right? Similarly to you guys, I'm been in this work 20 plus years, working in aging, working in dementia care, working in caregiving, and early on got acquainted with some of the limitations and boundaries and unfairness that seems to be set around people's intimacy and relationships. As one, we age, but two, as our physical and cognitive capacities change. I give a lot of credit to my mentors who said, yeah, this sucks and it ain't fair. Get in the game and do something about it. And we've been working progressively towards helping shift the way we think about intimacy and dementia in care settings, in relationships, as providers since then, but I'm certainly not alone. There are many folk who've been doing good work and whose shoulders that I certainly stand on. Let me get to the meat here. I guess that's sort of a status update, but I just wanted to do a little status update slash level set here. We're still in the age where sexuality and dementia is the third rail, right? Metaphorically. Like, we haven't quite made it past the phase of intimacy and dementia as providers as well as society, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that. But we've certainly made changes, and as generations have come up and we've embraced different value systems and different expectations, things have changed somewhat. But when I look really at the way that sexual expression and intimate expression is supported and accepted and enacted in a lot of the spaces where we as providers are, it's still pretty limited, right? And it's still very stigmatized. So it's well worth it to bring these conversations out and into the open and talk about the questions that we really have about how can we support folk who are trying to maintain and support intimacy for folks. And that can look a lot of different ways, as we'll talk, despite what might be sort of their physical or cognitive limitations and what setting they might live in. All right. I did not come up with this term, but it is my favorite to describe the goals around this area. This is sort of it can be related to age. It doesn't have to be. But the idea here that what we're really aiming for as providers and as people is sexual citizenship, which to me implies rights, right? I'm a citizen. I deserve things just by being a citizen. And sexual human rights is really what we're talking about here. I have the right to seek control over my own body. I have the right to have my own feelings about different people, about different activities, about different things. I have my right to different types of relationships. I have access to representations of myself as sexual, and this comes in a lot with ageism, right? And aging and sexuality. I have the right to public and socially grounded choices. I have choices at whom I'm able to be with, what I'm able to do, and where that might take place, right? Which is where a lot of us comes in when we're talking about folk who might be in skilled care settings or assisted livings or places, right, where we would kind of dub them institutionalized settings, right? They're not living in their own home. Some of them are still and are experiencing sort of their rights limited or their sexual citizenship questioned, which can be important, right? We're going to talk about this in balancing harm, right? And harm reduction approaches here. But there's also a sense that back to the status update, the pendulum is way over on the other side. It's like full restriction, like absolutely not, no, and here are all the things that you have to prove to me before you can step a toe outside that line. Like, we're pretty well still there, as opposed to right in the middle where we let people assume a amount of risk. Normal amount of risk, not a lot, but there's risk in walking out your door, right? In a nursing home, I could slip, I could fall, I could eat something that didn't sit right with me. there's no risk situation here. And that's another thing that like is a misnomer in this conversation is sexual citizenship has been taken all the way over here to you can't prove to me there's no risk, then you can't have it, to what's the most reasonable amount of risk that I can support and care plan around to reduce in order for you to meet your intimacy goals, which is really what we're looking for. Okay, let me see. I have something, a brave soul in the chat. How do you recommend a partner of someone with dementia obtain consent, especially if there are verbal limitations of their person? Fantastic. We're going there. Not the next slide, but we're going there. I'll get to that, Laura. Thank you for being brave. Over the last 20 years that I've been really looking into this, which is a short game compared to many of these topics, there are several challenges to sexual citizenship, particularly for folk who have some limitations, right? Physically or cognitively or both. And I'm going to go over some of those just to like talk with you about them. And to Laura's point here, one of those is sexual autonomy. And we'll talk a lot about the limits to sexual autonomy and how to support sexual potential versus like sexual deficit, right? Because we got a hold on that. We know everything about what's wrong, but we have a very little clue about how to optimize sexual citizenship when the challenge is high. So we're going to go there. One of the first challenges that we have around sexuality is honestly normal aging changes, right? Things change, right? So if you're a care partner, if you're a provider, if you're a person living with dementia and thinking about your own intimacy and sexuality, there are things that you're going to have experienced that might change that game for you, right? So let's fast forward all the way up to we're thinking about what might be an intimacy care plan for this person. We're also taking into account things like what age are they, right? So you can be any age and be in an institutionalized setting, but have you experienced some of these changes in your body that we might expect that we might have to adapt for if we're talking about maybe it's at home or maybe you're in assisted living, and your ability to really consent to some of these higher level interactions isn't in question. And we have to think about like what's going on that might keep you from the goal and how might we support you in obtaining that, given that we all go through different sexual hormonal changes in our body as we age. We all have medications that we're taking that can affect our intimate and sexual expression. Our relationships change quite a bit over time, and some people have sexual histories that are difficult, right? Might be coming to you for the first time and we're not aware like of maybe some of the traumas that might be lurking behind there too. So there's a lot of just basic things about people as we get into later phases of life that we have to take into account when thinking about just what's going on, what are my potentials here, what are the things that we might have to support, and what might be something we have to compensate for and adapt. Some of the things that dementia can change in someone's sexuality, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these things later, but one of the things that we see a lot in folk who have especially like frontal lobe dementia kind of things, right? Like FTD being a major one, and some more progressed Alzheimer's processes is apathy and emotional connection or lack of, right? So this makes intimacy in a relationship an extreme challenge. I see it a lot in the folks that I treat in the caregiver clinic. You know, if my loved one, care recipient in this case with dementia, is unable to connect with me emotionally at all, like it's just deadpan, like I can't get anything from, it's really hard for me to feel an intimate connection with them. How do I do that? This gets a little bit into some of this nonverbal, verbal, but not ultra communicative part, right, of folk too. So on the caregiver or the spouse side, the partner side, you may be frustrated, right, because your intimacy is changing in your relationship because they're no longer capable really of having reciprocal relationships like that. And how do we find ways to connect to each other that are still there, optimize and compensate? And gosh, I have to like thank you guys over and again for putting Julie first. because she really hit a home run for me on this because it is all about the person, right? And their values and their histories and their wants. And just like she was talking about with activity planning, we're really just thinking about the person, what their capabilities are, what their histories, what their values are, and how to find that connection point to match up, whether it was with music or other parts of activity. But oftentimes, with folk who might have a little bit less communicative ability or a little less agency or motivation, it might look like touch, rubbing arms, holding hands, giving a hug, sitting next to, right? Those more like lower level kind of sexual expressions, but intimate behaviors that really do form connection back might be where we go if we see something like really tough to have an emotional intimacy here. Let's see what kind of physical, non-sexual, but physical intimacy we can have that's satisfying to both of us. So thank you, Julie. I'm probably going to be referencing your stuff like all day, but I appreciate your groundwork with this. So emotional connection and apathy and agency might be one of the big things that we see different in dementia that might affect relationships. The other thing we're going to talk about a little bit later in consent is hypersexuality, right? So a lot of people are worried about that, like hyper behaviors, whatever they are. He can't stop eating, he can't stop smoking, and he never smoked, but now he's a chain smoker. He can't stop seeking sensation or even masturbating sometimes at home or if we get into a facility, right? So there's both a hyper arousal that's happening inside the person and a misunderstanding of how to meet that need and a compulsive behavior that's happening. That again tends to be much more likely when we see frontal lobes affected, right? So our FTD folks, our early frontal lobe impairment folks, we might see a little more of this hypersexuality and like advanced stages, right, of other types of dementia. But I'm sure that many of you in here have had either stories or experiences or heard about that one resident, that one care partner and care recipient, they didn't know what to do about this behavior. So that might also be something that changes about their sort of sexual expression due to dementia. We're going to talk a little bit more about hypersexual behaviors later on, and I won't save it all, but this again is a very similar to like finding the right fit for the need, right? So if someone is publicly masturbating because that's, their hypersexuality and they don't understand how to meet whatever physiological arousal or need they're having, either at home or in a residency. The care plan is how do we find a way to meet this person's touch need or this arousal to be sort of redirected without bringing in maybe bigger treatments, right? So certainly most of us know that medications can probably affect or alter behavior, but how do we use the environment and things like, and Julie, appreciate this, sensory stimulation activities for folks to care plan around how to meet kind of that base need for physical touch or non-sexual physical touch or companionship or compulsory kind of movement without them turning to like public masturbation. And maybe it's just literally like we redirect them to their private space, right? It just depends. But that we'll talk again more about that in a bit. All right, we have another chat. Thank you. We had a situation where my father-in-law was being intimate with another resident in an assisted living community. We were concerned about how to know if he was in a consenting relationship, how to determine that, how families should handle it. We were concerned her family would want to bring some kind of charges, right, and end their companionship. Thank you, Chris, first of all, for sharing this with us. And we're going to be talking much more about that as we go along, about what does consent look like at different capacities, how do we determine that, / how do we support consent potential versus just consent deficit, and what might families be able to do, or facilities or folks to be able to support it, and what the maybe risks or concerns may be. I'm going to skip the conceptualization stuff for this crew, only to say that one of the challenges we have in sexuality or intimacy in dementia, as well as intimacy in aging, is that people are still thinking about this very simply, right? Can you do these following four physical functions? You're fine. But if any of these following four physical functions are impaired, then you have dysfunction, right? And that's kind of it. We don't, in sexual medicine and medicine, in the way that we look at sexuality and functioning, we're not getting behind the things that are really important, which is, well, if I have dysfunction and I'm not able to have desire, I'm not able to be aroused, I'm not able to get an erection for biological males, or have orgasm or otherwise, um, that's, what if that's not going to change? Did you just tell me like I can never have intimacy or sexual pleasure ever again? And generally, if we're going with the biomedical model, yeah, we just told you forget it, or maybe one pill every week. Good luck to you. And for women, much nothing. We have no medical treatment for that. But that's not the only thing that's important to sexuality and intimacy. As we all know, there's relationship factors that involve communication and quality of relationship and trust and consent in a lot of ways, right? And there's emotional factors that go far beyond just how I'm functioning, right? So if we're only attending to that one thing, and that's the only thing we're checking off our list, we're missing a lot of stuff that's important to building intimacy and sexuality for a person and in a relationship. And part of this is, you know, we're constantly defining sexuality as intercourse. And that's going to put a lot of people out of this discussion, right? We're like, good luck to you. You can't do that. You're no longer part of the discussion. That's not what we're in here. And this has implications for consent, right? Is the only thing on the table intercourse or not? Absolutely not. This is a spectrum of behaviors, a bevy, a cornucopia of things that are about expression and pleasure, and none of them have to be sexual, right? So I think that we're narrowing in on these very specific things when we talk about consent and when we talk about people's sexual wellness. And we're dismissing and therefore not enhancing or optimizing all of these other things that could really be meeting really what people need and meeting their needs. So that's what my work around conceptualization was, and doing work on a kind of what do people think of their own sexuality as. And we found all kinds of factors: biological, psychological, social, cultural. It was really important. So as providers, that tells me I got to pay attention to that stuff too, right? One of the big things that we actually found in my research that really relates to this conversation about intimacy and dementia is that ageism is rampant. Not just as necessarily providers or folks treating older adults or older folk with dementia or people with dementia. It's they feel it for themselves, right? It becomes a part of our cultural narrative, these stigmatic beliefs and attitudes about older adults, right? Or getting older. And that translates to sort of a more sexual ageism, if you will, that it's like stigmatic beliefs and attitudes that we hold about a group of people who we think of as asexual, non-sexual, disgusting if they're sexual, etc., right? And therefore we don't pay attention to them. So your problems aren't legit. Don't do that. That's bad. I don't want to hear about it. That's not what happens here, right? And those things could be said in any setting, right? In any place, home, from adult children, from providers, from direct care workers, from yourself. Like those things permeate everywhere and really change the situation. We have a ton of gendered stereotypes too about this. Certainly, both men and women who are older and who have cognitive or physical impairment are at risk for internalizing ageism about themselves and about their own sexuality. Um, we have a lot of stereotypes. We have a few counters that I can think of. We don't have a lot in the space of intimacy and dementia. We have some with different sort of movies and books that come out from folks who talk about their own experiences, but the dominant narrative is stereotypical, right? So, therefore, most of us who receive training about how to care for someone, what is resident centered and person centered care, what does a relationship look like? We get the ageist version, right? Which is that doesn't happen. That's risky. You don't want to go there. They're not supposed to be doing that anyway. That kind of thing. Like other things are more important, right? Which generally maybe they are. There are a lot of things that are important, but this isn't unimportant just because other things are also important, right? So it does get inside you. We know this for a fact. You don't have to be the target of a discriminatory or ageist act to feel like being older is bad. It just happens to us because society, it's everywhere, it's embedded, it's insidious, right? So we can test this and find that we can not only find that people feel this way in general about like, oh yeah, when I'm older, I feel bad or I feel worse about myself because I'm older. And not like, wow, I'm walking around like Charlie Brown, like this is the worst thing ever. But like when you ask folks about like what it is to be older or what their feelings are about that, they will by and large get a negative response about aging, right? And that's not just lived experience, that is learned experience, right? From you're supposed to think this way because aging is bad. How that affects intimacy and dementia is, right, like we internalize the idea that our own sexuality is irrelevant and that we shouldn't want it. We shouldn't want intimacy. We shouldn't want these things because those are off the table for people like me. And that actually comes out when we look in research. I didn't put my study up here, but we did a study on embodiment of sexual stereotypes in older age and around dementia as well. And folks are like, no way, that's not, no, I'd never be able to do that. Like, people, what would people think, So it's there and it affects not just the way we treat people who might be older, but the way that we're walking around thinking about our own sexual experiences when we get older or my sexual or intimate needs if and when I have limitations. So it's not something to sneeze at, right? Everybody is walking around with some level of this inside them. Whether or not that gets expressed depends on the situations that you find yourself and how your providers treat you, how your spouse treats you or your partner, how your kids treat you, right? It all matters. How you treat yourself, right? All matters to whether or not you're going to be able to feel like your intimacy needs and wants are respected, right? We certainly know that inclusivity in every vein is not easy, but when we think about sexual and gender identity and aging and sexuality, it's definitely a triple whammy. There's so much less research, so much less information, and so much more discrimination, particularly in institutionalized settings, that it's worth overcorrecting for, right? Because we need to know that we're at risk for just by like them being who they are, our biases showing up and treating people differently. So if I'm faced with with this situation and I catch make sure, check your bias, okay, I'm not just making this care plan because without thought. I'm making this care plan and thinking through carefully, like, how have I addressed the potential for this person to be limited even more by their sexual identity? I know I'm breezing through some of this stuff, but I want to get to the meat. Certainly, the couple of people that we have who have questions, lots about consent, right? Sexual autonomy is one of the bigger challenges in this line of research that I have been working on and the folks that are in this space are working on, because generally, again, status quo is no. It's just blanketly, absolutely not, no, this is not going to happen. Or we're not going to let it, right? There's a paternalistic sense here where it's like, I know better than you. No. Regardless of if a person has any potential to engage in any intimacy, non-sexual, sexual, emotional, etc., it's often just swept away because we don't want to incur the risk. It's messy, it's tricky. We're going to get an infraction, all of that stuff. Or we don't know what to do with that. Like, this is just easier to just ignore, let him do his thing in his room, like all of that stuff. Um, but it's really important to people. And we found that out in an unfortunately interesting way. So, some of you folks, I saw some Iowa people on here. So, I bet you know this and remember this. But around 2014, 15, 16, there was a really big case of a state legislator in Iowa who was being sued by his stepdaughters for potentially violating his wife, who had dementia and was in the nursing home. It became like a really big deal. Actually, the New York Times had several articles about it. And then they opened up the comments on one of their articles and they had to shut it down like within a day because they received like 2,000 comments, and they just didn't have the capacity to like keep monitoring it. So then they wrote an article about the comments. But this was a pretty big deal, right? This is something that we don't see very often. Um, and we looked at those comments because this is a chance for people to publicly voice their opinion about sexuality and intimacy and dementia. And we'd never quite seen it at this scale. Certainly, the New York Times has a specific readership, so think about what you will about that. But it was a big national story. So people were talking a lot about, well, was this okay or not, right? Like, should he be able to, should his wife be able to engage in this with him, even though she's in a nursing home or even though she might have a cognitive limitations? And there was a lot of really rich and nuanced discussion, which is not how it often works in policy, right? Inside our institutions, the conversation is very short and it's very restrictive often. There's no finger pointing here. It's just it's easiest that way. There's some big implications for some of these. So it's very short, very binary, yes or no. So it's no all of the time, mostly. And that's it, right? End of story. We're trying to curb behaviors if we see them. We're trying to get rid of all of this stuff because it's too messy. The family's going to go crazy, all of these things. But people are saying, but look at this, right? Look at these different factors. They have to be considering this. Why they were in a loving relationship, they were married, they had a previous sexual history. Wow, this is really tough, right? They were asking about ageism and intimacy needs, and it was great to see. I mean, it was very difficult to think about and the implications for this particular person and this couple, but it was important to know that people weren't just thinking very simply about this either, or about their own needs, right? Because we all saw ourselves in this wife and husband pair and thought, "Ooh, what would happen to me?" You know, and hey, that's not fair. Or heck yeah, you better protect her. And yes, we do need to protect people from harm, and we do need to support um, resident-centered care and respect previous relationships and values. But this is a hard balance, and they were illustrating that. But it's a balance. It's not just a no, right? So we've been working on thinking about what is consent, or are there other sort of labels or things that we can call this sexual decision making or decision making around intimacy that are more true to the bigger picture? Not that we're saying the legal determinations of consent aren't important. They are. They're absolutely important. But often, I think when you talk to folk who are either living with their own care partners and trying to navigate this, or they're in an institution, they're not always just focused so solely on intercourse, right? Like our sexual medicine model says. It's how can I be close to my husband, right? How can we maintain this emotional intimacy? How can I feel cared for? How can they feel loved, right? And It's not always the case. Certainly, there are folk who are like, hey, this was our relationship. We had sex before. There was never a question. She's physically okay. You know, sounds good to me. Like, if we were at home, we would be able to be doing this. What's happened? How can we support this? Like, there are all kinds of things that are going on in here. But I think the one thing that I hope you come away with this is it isn't as easy as yes or no. It's not just one question. It's a series of questions that we should be asking ourselves about how can I make a resident centered care plan for someone's intimacy? Or if I'm at home and I'm a caregiver or care recipient, how can I think more broadly about this to adapt to some of the things that have been tough in building intimacy, but find that compensation, optimization ground to get connection and physical touch or care or intimacy? One of the things that I do want to tell you about is that I wrote an article with a sexuality PhD, sexuality education PhD, Natalie Hutima. It was in the ASA Generations Journal. And it's free. You can go on their website and you can Google it if you want. Um, Called Sexual Consent Potential. So we were kind of tired of people constantly being like, well, they don't do this, they don't do this, and they don't do this. Nope. And we're like, well, okay, they don't do this, they don't do this. But well, what do they do? What do they want? What do they need? What's the actual potential for risk and harm here? How can you mitigate that instead of just saying no? And how can you find a activity or a set of things that meet this person's need without having to escalate the risk, right? So it's like a harm reduction plan, right? Or a risk reduction plan, which we're all extremely capable of doing. It just takes more time, effort, and like you have to be supported to do this kind of stuff, right? Um, so we thought about the idea of what if we thought about this differently? Like, what's the potential to enhance maybe a more limited capacity? Not so that you can necessarily get to the top of the mountain, if you will, and get back your capacity to consent to sexual acts, which is the most legally regulated thing, right? Intercourse. But how can you get to the point where your wants and needs and your capabilities and the environment's ability to mitigate that risk meet each other, right? And we up your potential so that you can engage in some of this stuff. I do want to tell you that there legally, if we're talking about intercourse between two folks, there are a few very tried and true things that we need to pay attention to when we're thinking about consent for sexual acts. And some of them, one of them is always understanding. Most state laws, including North Dakota, which I did look at, most state laws are like they have to understand what they're doing, like kind of be aware at least. Like I need to realize that I'm engaging in some physical activity with you, preferably understand that it's intimate in nature, but at least I don't know what's happening, right? I don't know at all what's happening. Which does bring up the question of communication, right? That we'll talk about. Uh, some states do require that the person be able to have some reasoning, right? I am able to make an informed decision. I didn't find this in the North Dakota law. It doesn't mean it's not hidden in there somewhere, but the idea of like somehow I can weigh the risks and benefits and make my choice is part of reasoning. North Dakota does have voluntariness, which most states, if nothing else, will have understanding and voluntariness. Like I have to kind of be aware what it is that I'm being asked to do or that I'm engaging in, and I need to not be coerced into this, right? So that's the voluntariness. Some states go even farther, as you can see. New York State used to, I don't know if they still do, have like understand the moral implications of sexuality, which is really interesting because I believe that the moral implications of sexuality are not absolute for everybody. So it's real. I think it's hard to prove. In other words, like it's an interesting legal determination when you really have a hard time proving that. I think that that's important to the idea of understanding the person. Like, is this outside of their values? Is this outside of what they would have been comfortable with as we know them, or as their kids know them, or as their partner knows them? That's more like values and their own morals, as opposed to like some objective moral standard that exists out there, right? And there are states that really kind of absolve everything under the guise of marriage, right? So that is possible. Clearly, Iowa was not one of them, but some states do have that. And I think missing from most all legal definitions is values, which we just hit on too. But that's the arguably for me one of the more important things is to ascertain who that person is, what their values and needs and wants are in terms of like what did they value as a person, what do they continue to value as a person, and are those being met, or is that consistent with who they were? Um, Let me see, Chris, if I can think about. Let me do this one, and then let me go back to some of the questions about specifically about consent. There are a lot of other things that come into question when I think about consent. I've been talking to you guys about a lot of these, but it's not always a yes or no situation. Well, I should say it's never a yes or no, right? Consent isn't just yes or no. It's yes for this, no for that, yes for that, no for that, yes for that. It's just very individualized and situation specific. Um, we often decide that it's global, right? So if you've ever been in a situation where somebody said, oh, you failed that one test, so you don't have the capacity to make decisions, like, what decisions? Like what to wear today? Like if I want a bath or not, what I can eat for lunch, if I'm going to sit next to that person on the bed, if I'm going to opt for life-saving treatment. Like those all feel very different, right? And thankfully, most of the like sort of legal machination behind the scenes will say, yes, that's absolutely like there is so much nuance into if you can make this type of decision versus this type of a decision. Unfortunately, some of those have very specific tests about if you can do it or not. Sex isn't one of those, but we do have principles that we can lean on, right? Like, what's the risk in this particular situation with this or the harm to the person? Do we feel like they're being coerced? Can we, to, I think it's Laura's point, if they can't tell us, can we see, right? What do we observe? When we have nonverbal folk, are they willing participants in terms of I'm going back to that room because I enjoyed it, or I'm not shying away or flinching or showing anxiety or fear or lashing out in some way or having aggressive behaviors because this might be the cause here. So we're trying to glean these from more like nonverbal communication, right, paired with like help from a caregiver, help from someone who really knows this person's behavior and what that might be indicating. But that's more of like an assent kind of situation as opposed to legal consent. That's I want to go along with this, right? Type of behavior. I have a smile. I enjoy being with this person. I seek them out and sit next to them and grab their hand, right? That is an indication of voluntariness to me, right? Um, but there are a lot of other sort of non-verbal types of things that you can look for. And as a provider, or as a person, a direct care worker, we get sort of used to like, same if you're like, they don't want a bath and I made them take a bath and like they punched me in the face, like, well, nope, that wasn't for them. That wasn't what they wanted. Or they spit the water back out in my face, like, yeah, okay, they didn't want it. And we try to find those nuances for people and really, as we heard again with Julie's kind of presentation, get to know them and what their tells are, what their likes and wants are. Um, I think, Chris, to your point here, we really don't have a lot of community standards in terms of like if you're in an assisted living or if you're in a skilled care or another sort of institutional place that isn't your own home. People just don't have policies around this. Like their informal policy is no. That's the default mode. And there isn't a lot of nuance around this. And the policies that they have are usually people are like, oh, yeah, we have a policy about that. It's residents' rights. And I'm like, well, okay, but residents' rights don't really talk about some of these things or how that might apply in this situation. So we're kind of going on guts here and what we think. But there are some really tried and true things that we all use to help make decisions on daily care that that are the same, right? Are they um, emotionally in a good place when this happens? Can I glean from these nonverbals that this is something that they want? Are they, even in some instances, like we've had folk that tell us, well, we've had a really, like the gentleman with the music who was really non-communicative and kind of withdrawn before, but as soon as he got that music, man, that turned him on and up. um, Sometimes we see that, right? We see someone who's a little bit more withdrawn, or they have really anxious or scared behaviors, but all it took was literally someone like massaging their hands and painting their nails. And they needed touch. They needed something, right? Some intimate connection. And then their problematic or difficult behaviors went away because they got their needs met, right? It's a very similar type of information gathering here around what's the behavior in question, what's the risk related to this behavior potentially for that person, what do they value, what does their care partner say about this behavior, what does the family think, how's the family supported this, how can we support this in our environment, how can we reduce risk a little bit more, can we, what might be the need, let's try a care plan and like make it stepped so that if this doesn't work then we'll try this and this. And that's sexual consent potential right there, which is how can we meet this person where they're at with the acumen that we have as care planners and behavior observers, and really help find where intimacy can be met. And a lot of times it's going to be intimacy in a non-sexual way, but there may be some sexual types of touch or companionship. And Chris, it sounds like there was a little bit more of like a higher level relationship going on here and wondering. But a lot of times it's holding hands. It might be sitting next to, it might be helping them get into the same bed for a little bit and then helping them out. It might be a kiss on the cheek. It might be masturbating in their room, okay, but not bothering other people, right? But we're trying to find that spot where all of those things meet. Some signifiers, let me go back to sort of this idea. Some signifiers that consent might be in question. So Chris and I think Laura, both of your questions around like what would indicate non-consensual or consensual behavior, like, right, some of the stuff that starts to get us to question is often, right, they have cognitive limitations that we know of, whether it's a dementia diagnosis or an advanced dementia phase, or non-communicative or very physically frail or limited. That puts us at a different space, right, because we're like, okay, the risks inherent in this are such. And we need to start at a higher level of risk and think about those behaviors and activities that might be less risky, right, for that. But part of that is, what is their cognitive capacity, right? Do we already know that they really don't understand even who they are, or who anybody is, that they probably couldn't identify that person as the same person that came in and kissed them last time, except for the fact that they light up every time that person is there? Okay, that's an indicator. We're going to put that on the list of things that we can work with. Things that might also indicate non-consensual behavior would be behaviors that we're looking for that are showing fear, anxiety, not wanting, shying away, hiding from. You might be looking for physical manifestations of struggle or something like that. If there was question around, is this person consenting? It's not just about, do they have a diagnosis of dementia or not? I will say it's definitely part of the question of the risk level right here, but it's not the only one. If family is a tricky one. Family will come in at you and play like they own this conversation. And sometimes they do, right? Because they've got this person's interests at heart. But also, they're not the only part of the equation, right? I think the more information that we have about the person's needs, the person's ability, and we can front load some of these conversations with, look, this is how we're seeing this. Here's the risk in this. Here's what we're seeing. what are your concerns? This is how we practice resident-centered care here. Which part of this would you like to talk about? Those kinds of things can be helpful because I think families understandably can get pretty concerned and worried about this stuff slash litigious, as we saw in Iowa. And they're not the last word either. Um, if the families aren't allowed to talk to each other, that is strange, I will say. But, I mean, maybe if they were like, no, that family doesn't want to talk, so we're just going to tell you you can't talk to them. Certainly you have to allow for their wishes or wants for that. Um, but if you're worried about the idea of consent, you can always ask your father too, like, well, how does this usually go? Do you feel like, your partner wants this also? Is this something that you guys have talked about? Kind of figure out if there's an understanding between them, if they know what's going on, if everything feels voluntary in terms of do you make sure, do you ask, is this okay? And getting your answers for that and talking to the staff and the administration about your concerns if that feels safe for you. We don't want, for all we can hear, this is the level of harm, this is the level of worry that we have, but we know that this might be something for the other family. Then they're your conduit, right, to the family at this point, it sounds like. And nobody's fault, right? Creative, I don't know. I don't think this is taught or thought about often, like creative alternatives to intimacy and dementia. Although I will say, and I apologize, I just went over a couple of minutes, that Julie's presentation again is a really good one for this because when we're thinking about care planning for these, it's like activity planning, right? In a sense of what is this person like? What are their needs? What are the restrictions that they have that might mean that this activity isn't good, but this activity would be great? What's in this case, right? We want to know a lot about what's the risk of trying this out or how can we mitigate that? And then let's see how this works. If we give them hand massages in a very non-sexual way, or we have them sitting next to each other and holding hands and nothing untoward is happening, everything looks good, then we're going to support this. But we're sort of looking at all of those factors. Yeah. I mean, I don't doubt it, right? That's like a human right. As we talked about for sexual citizenship, Chris, you're doing a good thing by being an advocate for your dad in this way and trying to work with the folks there to support them in any way that you can, is a good fight to fight. I'm also happy to connect with you later if you want to talk more about alternatives or things that you would like help with. I apologize that I have gone over here, but you can email me if you'd like and you didn't get your questions answered.